Hello and welcome to Dialogue. In contrast to Western multi-party electoral democracy, China developed its own democratic system based on national conditions, namely the whole process people's democracy. So what is the whole process people's democracy, and how does it practice over the past years? And in what ways does it differ from Western democracy? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined by Zhang Weiwei, Professor and Director of the China Institute at Fudan University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion, Professor Zhang. Since we are talking about democracy, can you share with us what's your understanding of what is democracy, the essence of democracy, based on your study, different cultures, different countries, do they have different style of democracies?
If we compare Chinese democracy with, say, Western democracy, or in particular, American democracy, the key difference is we focus far more on what I call the substance of democracy or substantial democracy, while they place more emphasis on procedural democracy. And in the West, at least in real practice, democracy is more or less equivalent to one person, one vote, universal suffrage, plus multi-party system. But the Chinese approach is much more sophisticated, reflecting the Chinese cultural traditions. We focus far more on the purpose, objectives of democracy, especially good governance, and what the system can deliver to the people. That also had to do with the Chinese cultural traditions. I always describe China as a civilizational state. If you look at the opinion surveys in China, if you put two questions and see people's reaction, one question is democracy is equivalent to one person, one vote, or multi-party system. Or another is the state and the government and leaders should listen to the people and deliver their service, or serve the people. Overwhelming majority of Chinese, 80% at least, will choose the second, the latter option. So I call Chinese democracy is far more what I call people's livelihood-oriented democracy, which is working well.
So basically, democracy, in your understanding, is more than elections or holding elections or casting vote. It has something much more to that. For example, the Chinese practice probably stress more about the result, the outcome, rather than the election itself.
Indeed, that's why we call Chinese democracy as a whole process, people's democracy. In comparison, the Western approach or the American approach may be described as a limited process democracy. And it reminds me of the famous line from French philosopher Rousseau. And he was critical of the British Westminster model. And he said the British were enjoying democracy only once every 4 years. On the very day of election, yes, they were able to vote, and then they were deserted. So in the case of Chinese approach, the whole process, people's democracy, involves a far more range of affairs. For instance, in terms of decision-making, a good example of this is a 5-year plan. Usually, before this plan was finally adopted, there will be extensive consultations at all levels of Chinese state structure and Chinese society. So it's already part of Chinese life, social life, tens of thousands of rounds of consultation with all levels of the think tanks, people of all circles, and then you produce a plan which is really which can work. To a great extent, China's success so far is the result of successful planning. It's a strategic planning. It's not the old Soviet type of mandatory planning. It's about the orientation of the country, key areas of development. And then in the process of this implementing the plan, we also have supervisions. And then in the end, we have to review how you do well. You will see how delegates and deputies review the work of the government over the past year and even longer. And last year in the two sessions, what kind of promises the state has made, and 1 year later, to what extent they have been fulfilled or not fulfilled. All this will be checked. If you compare the report of Chinese Prime Minister, report on the work of the government, with the Union of Speech by the US President every year, the quality of the two speeches is totally different. Chinese is much, much higher. No comparison.
So if you are asked to, given what you have said, if you're asked to give a brief definition of whole process, people's democracy, what would you say, Professor Zhang?
Essentially, as I said, it's very much a contrast to what I call the Western style limited process of democracy. One election every 4 years, and then you cannot do much about it. This is a problem. In the case of China, if you look at the decision-making process, I already mentioned it. Before the decision is made, decision adopted, decision implemented, and then post, whatever actions, all these are reviewed, and the people are involved. And if you also look at the legislature itself, for instance, not far from here in Shanghai, we have this legislative outreach office, which is an organ more or less responsible for examining the first draft of the legislature. I'll give you an example. For instance, now China has this law on e-commerce. When the first draft was produced, this particular draft was sent to this kind of outreach offices across China. And in Shanghai, for instance, and then you ask ordinary people to make comments, to make suggestions. And in the end, these suggestions will be incorporated into the legislation. So you involve people into the process of making legislation, making 5-year plans. Rather than, if you look at the United States, a decision made, they use PR, whatever companies, to sell to the public. We don't do that. So the Chinese process of democracy is far more substantial and people involved, rather than the American approach, which is, I don't know, United States, from my observation, is a country surreal. It's a country that cannot solve problems because the system there cannot overcome the vested interests. That's the key difference. The Chinese system can do that.
You once said that there are double insurances for Chinese democracy: the party's leadership and the rule of law. Would you please talk more about that?
Yes, and this is a lecture I gave quite a few years ago when I discussed the issue of the Soviet Union's breakup. And I said, compared with the Soviet Union or Russia, we have a double insurance as democracy mechanism, so that we have avoided this kind of breakup and other problems. By this I mean, first, you have the leadership of the party, and Chinese Communist Party is an overwhelming force, positive force in China. This many people outside China fail to realize. Why? It is a holistic interest party. The West political parties are, I would say, parties and interest parties. Now, very few people dispute this. So when you have a holistic interest party, you take care of the overall interests of your people. That's important. And then second is about legislation. If you look at the Western, say Westminster democracy or Western style democracy, one key feature is about the protection of private property in their constitution or in their legislature. Same with China. We have our constitution, which protects both public properties and private properties. So when you look at the Soviet Union, how it broke up, in the first place, they did not have any more the Soviet Communist Party. The party was dissolved. Let's suppose it was a holistic interest party. It could really stop whatever foreign interference. Now that party was away, yeah. And then you have the legislation about privatization. In the end, in the constitution in the Soviet Union, there was no protection of public and private properties. So you have lost both. In the end, you have this disintegration of the country. You have the wealth of the Soviet Union, which has accumulated for about 70 years of socialism, wiped out, looted by the power of capital in the West. It's a huge lesson that China has drawn. So we have party leadership to ensure that whatever approach, it should meet the fundamental interests of majority of Chinese, rather than the power of capital, especially power of capital from the West. And this is not allowed. And then we have to protect both public property and private properties. So I call this double insurance and double guarantee, and we have succeeded.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you forget a minute, for a second about, political theories, if you look at the real experience or the real world, over the past 40 plus years, China has been successful. I mean, I would say very successful, probably one of the most successful countries in the world in terms of economic and social development, huge progress. Whatever system you may call it, it's a success. And the results proves it works. Do you think so?
Of course, this is one major reason. Some people call this performance legitimacy. Indeed, from the Chinese point of view, it's very much really rooted in Chinese culture. We believe that democracy should not be a coffee shop for empty talks. It must produce results. It must deliver. It must work around the interests of the most people. This is so fundamental, so crucial for Chinese mindset. For instance, when a few years ago, when Obama came to power as U.S. president, his slogan was change, change. But after 8 years, no change. The only change was his plan for medical insurance that was dissolved by Donald Trump. So for 8 years running, in the end, not much change. In the case of China, 8 years involved a lot of change for the positive on the whole. So the Chinese model is far more what I call the can-do spirit, and you have to deliver. And people are very demanding on that.
Well, another outstanding feature of the Chinese system or Chinese democracy would be, I think you have stressed in the past, that is meritocracy. That's the phrase people use to describe, the promotion or selection or election of Chinese officials, including Chinese leaders, based on their strong track record. Otherwise, it would be difficult probably to get a promotion. Tell us more about that.
Of course, meritocracy, as this English word, has different or slightly different connotations in, say, the West and in China. In the West, you may call, say, a political elite or intellectual elite, say, from Harvard, from Yale. And in the case of China, this is more about leaders who have been well tested at different positions and accumulated decades of performance and experiences. I often say, if you compare a typical leader in China, say the top echelon of the Chinese political structure, the standing committee members of political bureau, virtually all of them worked 3 terms, if not more, as number one of a Chinese province. Most of them have done that. So they've literally governed over 100 million people at least before they come to present position. So no doubt the Chinese leadership is among the most competent in the world. And really, I think, especially in the United States, this bar for leaders is too low, way below the Chinese bar. And then, the United States suffers from that.
Mm-hmm. Well, since last year, China has been putting forward this idea for, modernization or on a march to the Chinese modernization. Tell us more about that. Why the stress on the Chinese in terms of modernization here?
Basically, this Chinese model of modernization or Chinese style modernization proves that each and every nation should proceed from its own traditions, from its own cultures, from its own national conditions, and find its own way to success. In other words, we reject categorically this Western model or the so-called universal values defined by the West. Each every nation has their own cultures and values. For instance, I give an example. China regards fighting poverty, eradication of poverty, as a top human right. By the year 2020, we have achieved this objective of eradicating of extreme poverty, a remarkable achievement. If you look at the American political system, the Americans spent $2.3 trillion on Afghan war. It's a waste of money. It's a kind of killing and gross violation of human rights of Afghan people. You have the numbers, how many were killed, how many became homeless. It's a huge disaster, not only for Afghanistan, but also for the American people. In retrospect, this $2-3 trillion, if that amount of money were spent, it could have already eradicated the extreme poverty in the United States, eradicated the homeless in the United States. It could also cancel all the students' loans, very heavy loans, a huge burden on the American students and many people there. I also made a rough calculation with $2.3 trillion. If we use the Chinese model of fighting poverty as a reference, at least in theory, we can eradicate poverty, extreme poverty worldwide. Yeah. Yet, the American problem is with its political system, its democratic system. You cannot overcome the vested interests, especially the interests of military complex, the bans on wars, So I hope the United States will think seriously about this political reform. The system is outdated. It has to be reformed. Otherwise, the United States will go way down. No one can help it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Zhang, previously when people talk about modernization, many people would see that as a way, basically a term equaling to Westernization or Western modernization. So now we have the Chinese modernization or Chinese style modernization. Seems to me, obviously, this stresses on different parts of the nation building or national development.
Yeah, indeed, if we talk about modernization, there are some common themes. For instance, level of education, level of urbanization, level of industrialization, level of new technologies. All these are common worldwide. Yet the Chinese modernization has certain unique features. For instance, in the first place, China is such a large country. It's the world's most populous nation. 1.4 billion people, which means it's more than the total populations of the Western countries combined. So achieving modernization for 1.4 billion people, it's a huge challenge, but China has achieved that. And then we emphasize a lot on what we call common prosperity. In other words, you should not allow this gap between rich and poor grow too large. Indeed, we will try our best to avoid this gap between rich and poor. If you look at the plans, for instance, we have a whole province, Zhejiang province, has been singled out as a pilot project to narrow the gap between the rich and poor. It's doing well. So in China, in the Chinese model of democracy and modernization, there'll be no 1% against 99%, this whole movement in the United States. That will not happen in China. We can do much better. And furthermore, we also emphasize both material progress, hardware progress, as well as cultural ethical standards. So we don't want to see our country gripped by drugs, by crimes, by guns. People don't want that. So we have the highest safety rate in the world. And you can walk anywhere, even at midnight in China. It's safe, And if you look at the life expectancy, China is now also higher than the United States, 2 years higher. China now is over 78 years old, United States 76 years old. That's to do with the different approach to fighting the COVID. China did much better than the United States. So the Chinese modernization is a successful model. We don't want to impose this model on any other countries. We're not interested in that. But if we are successful, many want to look to you for sharing experience or draw some inspirations. This is understandable. We're ready to share our experience with others.
Professor Zhang, at the two sessions, the Chinese government has set the economic growth target for 2023 at around 5%. Many economists say this is underrated, probably 5%, because this is they say the potential is much higher than 5% of economic growth. Tell us more about that. Why the government is setting a target which is not that high compared with the potential.
Indeed, the Chinese approach has to do with the Chinese civilization. We are, on the whole, prudent people, and usually our targets are slightly below our potential. Hopefully, we can do better than this objective. But on the other hand, the 5% is not a small percentage. Given the size of China and Chinese economy today, if we can achieve 5% growth, say on the basis of last year's GDP, which literally means every 3 years with additional GDP of 5%, China can produce a France, or the total GDP of a country like France. Not to mention this is measured according to US dollar nominal terms. If by purchasing power parity, it will be even higher or much higher than this estimation. So it doesn't matter. In the end, from my reading of the major forecasts by international organizations like World Bank, IMF, they are more or less upbeat on the economic prospects of China for this year. I share this view.
Well, if you look at this economic situation beyond the 2023, a little bit probably further into the future, of course, China is trying to, let's say, stir this very important driver of economic growth, that is the domestic consumption, rather than continue to rely on export or investment. What's the prospect of that kind of, let's say, transformation?
In fact, over the past 10 years, with the progress in high quality growth, China's dependency on foreign trade has been already drastically reduced. And when China said we want to promote more domestic consumption, especially this year. One major reason is beyond China, the economic situation is not very encouraging. Virtually, IMF, World Bank have all somehow, had a slightly or more or less rather negative or pessimistic forecast for the world economy, except China. Even recession with high inflation, you can see the purchasing power of the Americans were going down. With the Ukraine crisis, Ukraine-Russian conflict, the inflation, the price of energy, food, the Europeans are also in a difficult situation. So their consumption powers are going down. So China have to rely more on its domestic consumption. We see a very high saving rate, So how to channel this domestic savings into consumption? This is something we should try to do, yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Zhang. Thank you for your time and insights. On that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our guest, Professor Zhang Weiwei. You can also find us on CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.